Welcome back to Sad Loner Shitpost Late at Night, because it's the one thing that gives him meaning in life. I'm your host, Squilliam Fancy Son. Today's video is a special one, as I get to talk about a topic that makes my fucking veins burn with fire, my eyeballs roll back into my head and out through my asshole, my very soul evaporate into fucking dust. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, the 28th, and I would argue worst, president in U.S. history. Part 1. Not So Humble Beginnings. Woodrow Wilson began life as a simple country boy, his childhood taking place during the Civil War and Reconstruction. His father was a racist piece of shit and a slave owner who identified with the Confederacy, so he passed these lovely teachings down to young Woodrow. According to later reports from confidants and cabinet members, the man loved to, and I quote, tell racist, darky jokes about black Americans. This man was so thoroughly racist, even by the standards of his time, he supported scientific racism, including some particular theories at the time that claimed black people were a whole different species and descended directly from fucking gorillas. This simple country slave owner eventually found himself in the finest colleges of the East Coast, studying at Davidson, Princeton, and the University of Virginia. He didn't achieve this easily, as God, in his eternal wisdom, decided to strike young Woodrow with dyslexia, a condition that prevented him from reading until he was 13 years old. While there, he got early practice pushing historical revisionist narratives, serving as the founder of the Debating Society and head of the student newspaper. He was also a choir boy in college, which is slightly hilarious, but while there, some more troubling tendencies started emanating from the young man. As any edgy college student does, he got into some weird philosophies during this time among academia. While studying and earning his degrees in history and political science, he developed a heavy elitist attitude, admiring the pre-Civil War planter gentry of the South and the nobility of Europe. He wanted to reform the American political system into an oligarchy/parliamentary system run exclusively by the elite, a la the House of Lords in the UK. He was specifically influenced by one Walter Bagehot, a British white supremacist and avid supporter of imperialism. He also picked up some fun ideas such as Christian predestination, but I think most of you have already checked out, so I'll move on. He finally left college after more health problems appeared. As I mentioned previously, God realized that he had fucked up and tried to erase the mistake. He attempted to become a lawyer, miserably failed, and then took his snapping turtle-looking ass back into the halls of academia. Chapter 2. Academic Nutjob. A good old country lawyer eventually found himself in a series of lecturing and teaching jobs across the eastern seaboard, utilizing the connections he had made. The specifics of the job are less important than what he actually did during the time, shaping the modern lost cause narratives by writing books and the aforementioned lectures. The lost cause myth is a historical revisionist narrative that claims the Confederacy was justified in succession. Being raised in the South by simple country slave owners, Wilson was a hardcore apologist for the institution of slavery and the broader Southern way of life. He, in fact, wrote textbooks that still influence American education today, which is why the Civil War is often taught in a way least empathetic to the South. Next time someone says the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was rather about states' rights, please inform them that A, it was the states' right to own fucking slaves, and B, that a long-dead racist snapping turtle is manipulating them from beyond the grave. He continued to be insane politically, being one of the first to define himself as a classical liberal. He also wrote a book all about how the government wasn't authoritarian enough, claiming the Constitution had a radical defect because it did not establish a branch of government that could decide at once and with conclusive authority what shall be done. He called for the abolishment of the House of Representatives because it wasn't nearly elitist enough, and generally continued to be the worst. Finally, he achieved the prestigious position of the president at Princeton, There, he continued his terrible human streak, admitting as few black students as possible, even as other Ivy League schools had begun to open up. While there, he had more lovely exploits, getting into a fistfight with ex-President Grover Cleveland, cheating on his wife while on vacation in Bermuda, and reforming the entire fucking curriculum. Finally, God threw another dart, hitting him with a blood clot that had permanently blinded him in his left eye. Chapter 3. Political Machinations. Unfortunately for the world, the blood clot didn't kill him, and instead seemed to make him stronger, as soon he went from the prodigy of Princeton College to the governor of New Jersey with aid from Satan himself. He was such an ineffectual piece of garbage that he only got this office from gross nepotism, his Democratic Party boss friends handing him the nomination, himself stating to agree to accept the nomination only if, and I quote,
"It came to me unsought, unanimously, and without pledges to anybody about anything."
Wilson quickly became a wolf in sheep's clothing, proclaiming himself to be a progressive despite his elitist leanings. He utilized the backing of unions and party bosses well, winning the office in a landslide. He quickly passed populist bills to guarantee public support, cracking down on corrupt institutions with antitrust laws, and simultaneously handing out exceptions to those close to him and their industries. Unfortunately for Wilson, and fortunately for everyone else, his hostile takeover of New Jersey ended when the state legislature flipped to Republican. He spent the rest of his term vetoing any and every bill in a tantrum, even pissing off James Smith Jr., the friend who had put him in office to begin with. He made more reforms in the closing days in office, pushing forward white workers' rights and education for handicapped children. However, the Antichrist managed to slide in a bill that arguably infringed upon the constitutional right to trial by jury. Seeing the writing on the wall, we began to look toward the presidency, seeing it as a next step forward to secure a future for the white I mean prosperity for America. Chapter 4. The Campaign Trail. Chased out of office as governor by the same people who'd elected him, Wilson sought not to just ruin New Jersey, but the country at large,
and eventually the world!
And so he sought the Democratic nomination in the 1912 presidential primary. Much like Joseph Entertainment Biden would years later, he feigned a shift to the left to choke out actual progressives, securing the black vote while remaining thoroughly racist. He pissed off many in the party during his dash for power, but due to some key endorsements from three-time presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan, Princeton smart boy Cyrus McCormick, and Democratic governor of the fair state of Indiana, Thomas R. Marshall, he secured 2/3 of the vote and won the nomination. Mr. Palpatine McTurtle faced two major opponents in the mad dash for La Casa Blanca, thick boy Howard Taft, and one of the greatest men in American history, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. Unfortunately for everyone, the country fell out of Taft's meaty paws as he and Teddy split the Republican vote. Also unfortunately for everyone, the wonderful Dixiecrats won a majority in the House and Senate. Oh dear. He soon put together a world-class cabinet, with amazing lads such as our friend Thomas Marshall as the VP, horrifying anti-Semite James C. McReynolds, and populist demagogue William Jennings Bryan. The cabinet was a strange mix of actually well-intentioned left-wing reformers and horrifying racists, so regardless, this was going to get interesting, but mostly horrifying. Chapter 5. Things get interesting, but mostly horrifying. Now accidentally commander-in-chief of a global superpower, Woodrow got to work domestically, passing some consumer protections, lowering tariffs, creating the FTC to investigate breaches of the antitrust laws. Those were all pretty good reforms, but you have to remember who we're dealing with here. He then proceeded to appoint horrifying anti-Semite James C. Reynolds and weird legalist John H. Clark to the Supreme Court. Ironically enough, he would later appoint the first Jewish justice at the behest of the reformist minority of the party. That may seem at least okay, or average for a president, but you haven't learned about his absolute failure of a foreign policy, and we're not even to the war yet. Wilson claimed to be anti-imperialist and isolationist, and yet at the behest of corporate executives, he intervened frequently in South America, using the U.S. military to illegally seize Panama, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Honduras. He also tried to play fourth-dimensional wizard chess in Mexico, constantly funding revolutionaries who would then inevitably turn on him. This fucking lunacy continued for his entire presidency, but we're going to focus on term 1 for now. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Wilson saw an opportunity to fulfill his ridiculous God complex by acting as a mediator that was completely unasked for. He kept annoying the European powers by trying to open peace conferences, and they kept telling him to shut the fuck up and go away. However, as much as he had delusions of being a martyr or Christ figure, he was also a fence-sitter, so despite being supposedly neutral, he started building up a military after a German U-boat sunk the Lusitania, a British liner carrying war supplies that also just happened to have Americans on it. It's also speculated, and I can't say this with any definitive authority, that he intended war against the German Empire eventually anyways, after the sinking of the Lusitania anyways. Why? Well, if there was one thing Wilson hated slightly less than black people, it was poor white immigrants. Wilson purportedly lamented the contamination of American bloodlines by the, and I quote, sordid and hapless elements coming in from Europe. It just happened that a ton of those were German or from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so you can draw some conclusions as you will. Chapter 6. He screws the pooch. After narrowly winning re-election and his wife dying from kidney disease to get away from him, Snapping Turtle Supreme received the Zimmerman telegram, intercepted by the British. It was a message from the Germans asking the Mexicans to war with the United States. In his re-election campaign, he said that his opposition winning would mean war with Germany and Mexico, and only he could bring peace. He then proceeded to declare war on Germany and continue fourth-dimensional proxy war wizard chess in Mexico. He sent 100,000 Americans to die, but the Entente would go on to win the war. Wilson is often considered a top 10 president, and I postulate that's literally only because he was a wartime leader. He was a racist bastard, but because he got involved in a global conflict for 1 year, all of a sudden, he's an amazing leader of men. People look back at his presidency with rose-tinted glasses merely because he won a war, and then they ignore his domestic policies, which, while filled with reforms, also disenfranchised people of color, European immigrants, and anyone not of white Protestant breeding, basically. Finally indulging in his God complex, Wilson oversaw the post-war treaties and created the useless League of Nations. Despite originally saying that he would secure self-governance for all people involved, he gave much of China to the genocidal Japanese Empire, took islands for himself in the United States, and gave the Ottoman Empire over to be oppressed by British and French colonial forces. He was a fucking asshole. Chapter 7. The Grateful End. Fortunately, Wilson had a paralyzing stroke that effectively ended his reign of terror, but that wasn't before so much damage was done. He claimed to be an isolationist opposed to colonialism, and then imperialized South America and intervened to help imperialism in China and the Middle East. He claimed to be a progressive, but he glorified the KKK and disenfranchised millions. He claimed to be an historian, but then pushed revisionism. After all, he was quoted as saying, "Overreach on the part of the radical Republicans justified extreme measures to assert democratic white majority control of state governments." He died in 1924, and I'm fucking glad he did. He was a fascist asshole, and I fucking hate Woodrow Wilson!